Good afternoon and welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you to the first event in our summer term. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar. I'm Deputy Director of the LSE South Asia Centre here in the Lund School of Economics. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you especially to those who've been waiting for this. And we will be going to start the event very soon. Our first event this term is part of our book discussion series titled Fact and Fiction. And I am very, very happy to say that the discussion today focuses on a recently published book last year, 2021, from Cambridge University Press, titled Sikh Nationalism, From a Dominant Minority to an Ethno-Religious Diaspora, which is co-authored by Gurdwaras Singh and Giorgio Shani, both of whom are present today in the discussion, and I'll be introducing them in some detail very shortly. Before I go on to make a few more announcements, I do think that it is absolutely right, having once worked in publishing myself, that I want to thank Lauren Simpson of Cambridge University Press, who was very, very supportive in sending copies of the books to the panelists so that they were able to read it in good time for this afternoon's event. And I'm hoping that Lauren is listening to this as I speak. I wrote to her yesterday to say that please do join in for the event. I'd like to say a very big welcome to the audience who have joined us, not only from across the world, but also from across various time zones, and also for the interest that so many of you have shown since we started advertising this event. The event is being held actually via Zoom. The discussion is happening on Zoom, but you're watching it on YouTube. And I'd welcome members of the audience to kindly pose questions on YouTube via the chat function, which has been enabled. And if you would like to pose a question to a particular speaker, then please do mention it. You're equally welcome to pose a question to the complete panel. A recording of this event, an unedited recording of this event, will be available on our center's website in the event archive section from tomorrow morning for those of you who may have missed it today or may want to go back and listen to it again. If you would like to tweet, then please do tweet and tag us at SAsiaLSC. You will find the Twitter handles of individual speakers in the details on your YouTube page if you would like to tag them. And we'd be absolutely delighted to read what you have to write. I should add here, especially for the benefit of those who are new to events at LSC, that had this event been held on site, then at LSE, members of the audience have the right to ask questions without revealing their identity. As such, and trying to remain as close to the spirit of that, when I ask questions on behalf of members of the audience to the panelists, I will not be taking their names. I know that their names will be visible on YouTube, but at least we'll try and stay as close to the spirit of this as possible. It is now my very pleasant duty to introduce the speakers who are also joining us literally from across the world, from the West Coast all the way to Japan and various other points in between. I'm very grateful to every panelist, to every speaker for agreeing to do this event. You're all very busy. And as I always say in all our events, we couldn't do these events if you didn't give so freely of your time and your intellect and your expertise. And that's what makes these discussions so animated. So thank you very much from the LSE South Asia Center for doing this. We have had, for the benefit of the audience, I say, we've had a brief chat just before we went live, and we've decided on an order of speakers. And each speaker will speak for about 6 to 8 minutes, and it will then be followed by a discussion and also, of course, questions that we are hoping that you will send across to us via the YouTube channel. The book will be introduced by the co-authors first, and thereafter each of the panelists will be invited to speak. I'm going to introduce the panelists now. I'll also come back in between and introduce the panelists once again, so that those of you who may be joining late will know the details of each speaker. Our first speaker will be Gurdwara Singh, who is Emeritus Professor in Sikh and Punjab Studies in the Department of History in the School of Oriental and African Studies here at the University of London. And Gurdwara, alongside his many other publications, is co-author of the book under discussion today, Sikh Nationalism, From a Dominant Minority to an Ethno-Religious Diaspora. Giorgio Shani, the other of the co-authors, is Professor of Politics and International Relations at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and alongside his other publications has co-authored with Gurdwara this book, Sikh Nationalism, From a Dominant Minority to an Ethno-Religious Diaspora. Between Gurdwara and Giorgio, they'll speak for about 15 minutes. They've divided the time between themselves, and they'll introduce the book. All the panelists have had the time to read the book, so please, to members of the audience, please do listen to Gurdwara and Giorgio carefully, because this summary introduction is really for your benefit so that you can engage with the discussion that follows more meaningfully. Bashar Singh is Professor and Dr. Jasbir Singh Saini Endowed Chair in Sikh and Punjab Studies at the Department of Religious Studies, the University of California, Riverside, and amongst other things is author of The Life and Work of Guru Arjan, which was published in 2006. Katarina Kinval is Professor of Political Science at Lund University, with research interests, amongst several other things, in religion and nationalism, with a focus on South Asia and Europe. Radhika Chopra retired as Professor of Sociology at the Delhi School of Sociology in the University of Delhi in 2020. Amongst her other publications, Radhika is author of Militant and Migrant, The Politics and Social History of Punjab, which was published in 2011. Finally, the discussant for this afternoon is Lou Fennick, who is Professor of History at the University of Northern Iowa, an expert in Sikh studies, and author most recently of The Cherished Five in Sikh History, which was published last year in 2021. I'm now going to hand over to Gurdwara to speak. Please speak now, Gurdwara. You have about 10 minutes.
I want to begin by thanking the LSE Centre for South Asian Studies, Nilanjan, and colleagues on this roundtable for hosting this event today. I joined the LSE in 1976 as an undergraduate, and a decade later completed a PhD. LSE education and the LSE School of Nationalism were a lasting influence on my academic development. This work has been very long in the making and is published to coincide almost with the 75th anniversary of the partition of India. The anniversary is timely to reflect on what the late Professor Anthony D. Smith of the LSE called the nationalism of small peoples. Our objective in writing this work was to, one, provide an accessible text for students, primarily for students, and then scholars and general readers, to situate the Sikh case within the comparative literature on ethnicity, nationalism, and on ethnicity, nations, and nationalism. And thirdly, to start a debate, hopefully, about the need to study Sikh nationalism seriously, to move beyond the existing state of the literature on the subject. The main puzzle we address is why the Sikhs, who appear to have a clear religious identity, a territorial homeland, a language, and a vibrant diaspora, struggle to conform to frameworks of ethnicity, nations, and nationalism. Are the Sikhs a nation? If so, what kind of nation? And how do the politics of Sikh nationhood manifest themselves in the modern period in South Asia and in the diaspora? Sikh studies is marked by sharp methodological divisions. Our focus is, however, on empirically mapping Sikh subjectivities to understand the community's politics. We use two narratives of Sikh identity, religion and the nation, and add a third as a minority, both in South Asia and in the diaspora. We examine how these narratives as a religion, as a nation, and as a minority coalesce and diverge, and how they have shaped the politics of Sikh formation since the end of the 19th century. Minority nationalism presents special challenges. As a result, we use what we call an integrated approach to bring together four complementary perspectives. Our main intellectual debt is to Professor Anthony Smith and his ethno-symbolic approach, which emphasizes the power of nationalism as rooted in the myths, memories, traditions, and symbols of the community, and the ability to reinterpret them. I won't say much more on this because I think Giorgio might want to add something in his presentation. Second, we draw on the literature on minorities and how minority outlooks are shaped by the world around them. The efforts of the Muslim League and the Congress in the Punjab at nation building before 1947 and the Congress after 1947 have shaped Sikh minority consciousness. The consciousness of being distinct and a vulnerable minority has also been reinforced by the politics of the diaspora. Third, we view the diaspora from the late 19th century onwards as an integral part of the development of Sikh nationalism. The diaspora is not, and I repeat, not an independent actor. The diaspora and the Punjab, where nearly 80% of all Sikhs live, are mutually dependent, sometimes more, sometimes less. And fourth, we draw on the literature since 1979 on the rise of religious nationalism to reassess the function of the National Congress's secular nationalism and BJP's Hindu nationalism in managing religious minorities like the Sikhs, as well as the implications of religious nationalism for Sikhs themselves. The book is largely historical and chronological, except for two chapters, chapter 1 on the theories of nationalism and chapter 8, which covers the diaspora. I really don't have much time to go into the content of the work. So what are our main conclusions? Well, against the prevailing consensus in Sikh studies that religion is a main narrative of Sikh identity, we argue with evidence that the nation and as a minority are also important narratives in the modern period. The latter two are not contradictory, but complementary. They have been highly influential in shaping the politics of modern Sikh formations in the homeland and in the diaspora. As a minority and as a religious minority, Sikh nationalism is identity-driven. It has a strong territorial commitment to the Punjab, but arguably as a minority, a global diasporic minority can also accommodate deterritorial imaginings of the nation. Openness to the other, reflected in the Sikh ethic not to dominate or be dominated, enables Sikhs to accommodate religious pluralism and multiculturalism. The post-colonial idea of Sikh leadership before 1947 was religiously plural Punjab, in which neither the Hindus nor Muslims had a majority. A separate Sikh state was an option of last resort, the logic of religious nationalism that threatened to divide the subcontinent. Similarly, the campaign for a Punjabi Suba was a campaign against majoritarian domination. Whether in the 1940s or 1980s, mainstream Sikh leaders have been reluctant separatists. Sikh nationalism is best viewed as a continuum with multiculturalism at the one end and a separate state at the other. There is a vast space in between, whereas the Congress and the BJP view India as a multicultural polity within the overarching conception of a secular or Hindu nationalism. For most of the post-independence period, the mainstream Sikh leadership of the Akali Dal has viewed India as a multinational state, in which the Sikh conception of the nation, as represented by the Anandpur Sabha resolution, can be accommodated in an alternative conception of the Indian Union, in which the powers of the center are limited. It is an alternative conception of the idea of India, of an Indian federalism that seeks its inspiration from the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. inevitably reflecting on the Sikh case, the volume calls for a radical reappraisal of the thin distinction between Congress's secular nationalism and the BJP's ethnic Hindu nationalism. So the Sikh case, as I pointed out in the early 90s, suggests that India should be coded as an ethnic democracy. This reading, I would argue, is also underscored by the common experience of how India's peripheral regions have been managed since 1947. So finally, comparatively, the work demonstrates that complex minorities like the Sikhs can be read within the literature on ethnicity, nations, and nationalism, that Sikhs as a minority in the Punjab and the diaspora have been at the forefront of pioneering multiculturalism, participating in power sharing arrangements like consociationism, and living in religiously diverse societies. And that the Sikh case is an example of a nation without a state that might thrive in conditions of post-sovereignty. Alternatively, as a result of nation breaking and overt religious assimilation, it might experience a rapid decline in nationness. In conclusion, the work draws attention to the challenges, dilemmas, and problems of studying the nationalisms of small peoples. It ends with a plea to take the study of Sikh nationalism more seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gurharpal. I'm sure we will have several occasions later on in the discussion this afternoon to return to the contents of the book, and please do speak at that time more about the contents which you and Giorgio know best. I am now going to invite the co-author of this volume. Giorgio Shani is Professor of Politics and International Relations at the International Christian University in Tokyo in Japan, from where he joins us this afternoon, and is co-author, as I said, of Sikh Nationalism from a Dominant Minority to an Ethno-Religious Diaspora, alongside all his other publications. Giorgio, please speak now. You have about 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Nilanjan. I would like to thank Gurharpal for his summary and also for inviting me to join his project. I was primarily responsible for chapters 1 and chapter 8, which gave an overview of different theories of nationalism, and also the chapter on the diaspora. I'd also like to thank Nilanjan for organizing this roundtable, and like Gurharpal, bringing me back to LSE. I studied and graduated at LSE almost 30 years ago. I had the misfortune of studying international relations, which is a misnomer because it conflates 2 central concepts, the state with the nation. So there was absolutely no discussion of the nation nationalism. Yet luckily, I was able to take classes in the sociology department with the late, great Anthony Smith, and like Gurharpal, Smith's understanding of nationalism, and I would say the contradictions within Smith's work as well stimulated my interest in nationalism. I should point out that my interest in Sikhism comes from being partially of Sikh descent, but for having relatives who are not religious. I have some relatives who are very religious, but other relatives more closer to me who are not religious, but who identify with being Sikh in a non-religious sense. So this created an understanding of Sikhism or the idea of a Sikh identity, but a Sikh identity which, although it draws an ethnic roots, could also, particularly in the aftermath of the events of 1984 and the storming of the Global Temple, be constitutive of a nationalist identity or of a national identity. Now, I mentioned the contradictions within Smith's work, and I think one of the contradictions here, which we bring out in our volume, is in seeing nationalism as a modern phenomenon. So remember, his first lecture started, nationalism is a doctrine which was invented in Europe in the French Revolution, which sees sovereignty as residing in the people. Yet at the same time, Smith acknowledged, and he stressed the idea that the nation, which also can be seen as a modern political community, drew its sustenance upon older ethno-religious communities, ethnies, as he called them. So in this sense, we can talk of nationalism, although as a modern phenomenon, it is derived to a large extent on pre-modern forms of political community. Now, the book, as Gurharpal mentioned in his concise summary, focuses on three narratives of Sikh identity. My own view is to look at Sikhi as a cosmology. This is not within the work, but more of a relational cosmology where there are no clear distinctions here between self and other, between Hindu and Muslim. But as part of the colonial project of modernity, Sikhism was forced into two prevalent narratives which continue to dominate Sikh self-understandings of identity today. Firstly, Sikhism as a world religion or a panth. Sikhs are seen as followers of Guru Nanak with a sacred script, the Guru Granth Sahib, and institutions, the Khalsa, the Golden Temple. And secondly, the Sikhs as a nation or a Qawm. Sikhs as a people who share a common language, Punjabi, a territorial homeland, the Punjab, and after, this is something we look at explicitly within the book, the development of a Sikh political system around the SGPC Akali Dal complex. The third narrative which we add to the discussions on the Sikhs, third narrative which emerges in post-colonial India and also emerges in the diaspora, is the idea of the Sikhs as a minority or a diaspora, a religious minority in India and an ethnic minority in the West, where narratives of diaspora are strong. The main theoretical focus of our conception of nationalism comes from Smith's understanding of ethno-symbolism, which focuses on the inner dimension of Sikh subjectivity. So we take explicitly an ethno-symbolist approach, which looks at the role of religious myths and historical memories in the construction of a nationalist imaginary. Of particular importance is the understanding of the nation in Smith as a sacred communion,
Sure.
which brings in an understanding of the religious significance here of nationalism. It also integrates the study of the diaspora with the nation. I don't have very much time to speak more about the volume. However, I should point out that working with Gurharpal gave me an opportunity.
Giorgio, you've switched off your microphone.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me now? I just wanted to conclude.
We lost you where you were thanking Gurharpal. So go on, say thank you. Gurharpal will be very happy.
Okay, before thanking Gurharpal, I wanted to point out that working with Gurharpal gave me an opportunity also to reassess the conclusions of my first book, which looked at Sikh nationalism and identity in a global age. I've shared that on chat, and perhaps we can return to that in the discussion. So thank you, Gurharpal, for giving me the opportunity to reflect on the idea of Sikhism as a global Qawm, which is something we can look at later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. I'm sure, as I mentioned, even when Gurharpal finished his presentation, that I'm sure we will have occasion later on in this discussion to return to the contents of the book in greater detail. But I think between the two of you, you've presented a very, very good summary introduction to the book, which I have read, so I know so, and I'm sure the audience has benefited. Before I invite our first panelist, which is Bashar Singh, I just wanted to say to the audience that please do ask questions if you would like to through the chat function on YouTube. Please feel free to ask questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you would like to pose your question to a particular speaker, please do that and mention it. You're also equally welcome to pose a question to the complete panel. I'm now going to invite our first panelist. Bashar Singh is Professor and Dr. Jasbir Singh Saini, Endowed Chair in Sikh and Punjab Studies in the Department of Religious Studies, the University of California, Riverside, and amongst other publications is author of The Life and Work of Guru Arjan, which was published in 2006. Bashar Singh, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Nilanjan Sarkar, for inviting me to participate in this very exciting book discussion. I would like to congratulate Dr. Gurdwara Singh and Dr. Giorgio Shani for producing an excellent work on Sikh nationalism. There's no doubt that this book will have a long shelf life and scholars will consult it even after 50 years. It is thus of utmost significance that this book must reach in the hands of the policymakers of the Government of India, as well as in the hands of Sikh leadership in the Punjab, particularly the SGPC and the Shomani Akali Dal. The central argument of this book is based upon the claim to move beyond the existing tropes, especially religion, that have defined Sikh subjectivity so far. According to our authors, an integrated approach to nationalism, identity, and diaspora offers a more comprehensive understanding of Sikh aspirations for self-determination since the late 19th century. For them, the Sikh case provides striking new insights into minority religious nationalism in the colonial and post-colonial context and question the centrality of homeland in the discourse of long-distance nationalism in a globalized world, thus making possible deterritorialized nationalism. The major strength of this book lies in its integrative approach, drawing on theories of ethnicity and multiculturalism and nationalism, especially Anthony Smith's ethno-symbolic approach to understand emergence of modern Sikh nationalism. A nation denotes a named political community bound together by common rights and duties and sharing ancestral myths and memories. Basically, a nation is built on 2 maxims. First, the common rich heritage, and second, the desire to live together. The nation differs from an ethnic and religious community in that it is primarily a political community which seeks a state of its own. For me, the most impressive feature of this book in the table on page 14, providing the summary of literature on ethnicity and nationalism and the Sikhs. It examines different approaches such as primordialism, instrumentalism, modernism, ethno-symbolism, post-colonialism, and of external and internal varieties, globalization, diaspora, and transnational studies, and religious nationalism based upon ideologies proposed by different theorists. It skillfully contextualizes the works of Joyce Pettigrew, Khushwant Singh, Paul Brass, Rajiv Kapoor, Darshan Tatla, A.S. Narang, Shindar Purewal, Gurdwara Singh, Harneek Deol, Giorgio Shani, Richard Fox, Van Dusenbury, Harjot Brai, Arvind Mandate, Brian Axel, Mark Jengensmeyer, and Cynthia Mahmood. Although I had read most of these individual authors, the comprehensive analysis offered in the present book has enhanced my own understanding of the complexities of Sikh nationalism. That's why I admire the work of our 2 authors, whose interpretation is so data-rich and substantive that there simply will not be another book like this for a long time. Now I will turn to some questions that come to my mind while reading different chapters. The second chapter covers a lot from pre-modern period to modern period of colonial rule, and it brings the issue of militancy, the institution of the Khalsa, and Sikh sovereignty into focus. True, the notion of sovereignty is intimately linked with the development of Sikh nationalism after the inauguration of the Khalsa in 1699, leading to the state formation 100 years later under Maharaja Ranjit Singh. I think the idea of sovereignty, Patshahi, needed a more sustained development from the teachings of Guru Nanak than what we find in the second chapter. The authors do cite Arvind Pal Singh Mande's broad-ranging assessment of Sikh sovereignty in heteronomic terms arising from conditions of political control and subjugation. The term sovereignty refers not only to the ability, but also the right to freely express one's life world with the power to authorize one's own speech. The quality of speaking truth to power poses a direct challenge to conventional notions of political sovereignty that contest colonial and modern Western notions of political sovereignty. This is what Guru Nanak did when he challenged the Mughal invader Babur in his Babur Bani. Guru Gobind Singh's creation of the Khalsa did not mark a break with Guru Nanak's idea of sovereignty. Sovereignty is inherent in the process of transformation, of becoming a true Sikh in adopting the life practices that Guru Nanak advocated. The third chapter deals with the emergence of modern Sikh nationalism from 1880s to 1930s. The idea of Sikh sovereignty was at work in the Singh Sabha reform movement during the colonial period, when spokesperson of the dominant wing of Tat Khalsa, Khan Singh Nabha, advanced the argument by using scriptural passages that Sikhs were not only a separate religion, dharam, but also a separate nationality, qaum. Written originally in Hindi, his pamphlet, Hum Hindu Nahi, We Are Not Hindus, was a seminal moment for modern Sikh identity, a declaration of Sikh ethnicity. Our authors have summed up this development as a highly distinctive pre-modern ethne combined with modernization to give rise to Sikh nationalism. But it was a nationalism constructed around the symbolism of Khalsa because it represented much more clearly the hopes and aspirations of the community of Sikh Commonwealth. They further argue that the Khalsa Sikhs, Janus-like, look to the past but embrace the future with confidence. In the early decades of the 20th century, the Tat Khalsa reformers also contributed to two important legal changes. First, in 1909, they obtained legal recognition of distinctive Sikh wedding ritual in the Anand Marriage Act of 1909. Second, in the 1920s, they helped to re-establish direct Khalsa control of the major historical Gurdwaras, many of which had fallen into the hands of corrupt Mahants, custodians supported by the British. The Akali movement began in 1920s as a non-violent agitation. This is sometimes described as the third Sikh war of 1920s, although it's better known as the Gurdwara reform movement. It was finally terminated by the drafting and passing of the Sikh Gurdwaras Act of 1925, under which control of all Gurdwaras passed to the Shromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee. Control of the Gurdwaras gave the SGPC enormous political and economic advantage, making it the authoritative voice of the Sikhs from a legal perspective. Here is my question to our authors. Do you think the various governments in post-colonial India have regarded the Sikh Gurdwaras Act of 1925 as a problem? Considering past attempts to get rid of this colonial legacy, is there a possibility to rescind this act to control Sikh nationalism? Reading the very insightful chapter on the partition of India, based on some rare documents, I was rather offended by derogatory remarks made by Lord Louis Mountbatten later about his first meeting with Master Tara Singh and Gyani Kartar Singh. These two, he says, these two jungly-looking old men were immensely learned in their knowledge of every part of the cabinet mission's negotiations and subsequent debates in the House of Commons. Unquote. Despite the use of the phrase jungly-looking old men, reflecting his colonial mentality to regard other people as savages that need to be civilized, Mountbatten could not resist admiring their sharp intelligence. In fact, Gyani Kartar Singh was regarded as the brain of the Sikhs within the Panth, while Master Tara Singh was held in great esteem as undisputed leader. Some historians argue that Sikh political leaders were found uniquely wanting in the negotiations with the British, the Congress, and the Muslim League because they painted themselves into a corner. Sikh leaders did their best in their strategies to cope with the fast-moving events of partition, and East Punjab ultimately became a gift of India because of their efforts. The rest of the chapters in the book deal with post-colonial situation. I will just focus on 5 major themes from those chapters.
Bashar Singh, if I could ask you to finish soon, please.
Okay, I'll do it quickly. First, promises made to Sikhs before partition of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi were not kept. This has been a constant refrain in Sikh grievances against Congress government. The majority of Sikh representatives within the Constituent Assembly refused to ratify the Constitution because the community's demands had not been addressed. The legal assimilation of Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs under category Hindu in Article 25B has been a constant source of resentment among the Sikhs till now. The Bajpayee government established the National Commission to review the Constitution, headed by Justice Venkatacharya, who made the recommendation to change the wording of this Article 25B as follows, quote, providing for social welfare and reform or throwing open of Hindu, Sikh, Jain, and Buddhist religious institutions of a public character to all classes and sections of these religions, unquote. This recommendation has yet to be implemented. Second, the Punjabi Suba campaign. Our authors have missed to mention the name of Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri, who became sympathetic to the demand after the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965 because of the role of brave Sikhs in helping the soldiers at the border in defense of the nation. Shastri set up a parliamentary committee to examine the case of Punjabi-speaking state. Third, interference in Sikh political system. The process to break the Akali hegemony on Sikh politics began with a half-page advertisement in the New York, October 12, 1971, by Dr. Jagjit Singh Chauhan, a former finance minister in Punjab, led by Chief Minister Lakshman Singh Gill, who headed a minority breakaway group of Akali Dal supported by Congress. Chauhan was a hawkish person who became the self-proclaimed president of Khalistan. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi communalized Punjabi politics in 2 main respects, through appeals to a pan-Indian Hindu community at the national level and through direct intervention in the Sikh political system at the state level in her battle to assert her authority over the Congress party nationally and provincially. She became insensitive to regional demands for more autonomy as she ruthlessly centralized power. Fourth, the unbridled power of the state. In order to consolidate its power, Indian state freely wielded accusations of treason against the Sikhs. The slogan of Khalistan served as a lightning rod for the accusations of treason. Through intensive propaganda, charges of treason were deployed as a tool to combat the power of Sikh establishment. However, one must acknowledge the limits of this strategy that can easily threaten to backfire. Not all Sikhs within the state would eventually could be branded as traitors as unproblematically. Nevertheless, it was the precariousness of the social order in the 1980s and early 1990s that justified first to torture or killing of all separatists, then anyone who knows a separatist, those who are friends or family to those who know separatists, and so forth. Terror results from the unbridled power of the state. Our authors state the figure of 30,000 deaths of Sikhs in the decade after Operation Blue Star, whereas other scholars like Darshan Tatla give the number closer to 100,000 deaths in the decade. Final, Sikh nationalism in the age of globalization. In Table 9.1, our authors have skillfully mapped diverse expressions of Sikh nationalism in 21st century. They have argued that transnational communities like the Sikhs have fostered new imaginaries of deterritorialized nationalism. It is therefore possible for Khalsa Panth to escape the long shadow of territoriality cast by the myth of Westphalia and reclaim sovereignty invested in it by Guru Gobind Singh at Anandpur on Baisakhi Day of 1699 without the establishment of Khalistan. These arguments make sense in a global framework based upon universality of Sikh values. They may not appeal to a fringe group of Sikhs whether in the Punjab or in the diaspora, who are still involved in raising the slogan of Khalistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bashar Singh. Gurharpal and Giorgio, at least now we have a good summary of the book and the chapters as well. So Bashar Singh has served a very important service. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I had to rush you to stop, but I did want to give enough time to the others to speak as well, but I'm sure we'll be able to come back to some of the points that you've raised this afternoon. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Katarina Kinval, who's Professor of Political Science at Lund University with research interest, amongst other things, in religion and nationalism, with particular focus and interest in South Asia and Europe. Katarina Kinval, please speak now. You have about 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I really thoroughly enjoyed the book, and it brought me back to when I was writing my own book on globalization and religious nationalism in India, when I looked at the comparison between the Hindu and Sikh community. And my work after that has been perhaps more on Hindu nationalism, but this book really brought me back to my work on Sikh identity and Sikh nationalism. I really enjoyed the book, and I think I see it as, corresponding to the previous speaker, as a rare attempt to provide both a historical and sociological account of Sikh nationalism and ethno-religious diaspora, but also a very thorough political understanding of how Sikh nationalism has evolved, but also in relation to how it's unfolded in relation to the 1984 Blue Star operation, and also, of course, what came after. So I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I think it's actually one of the best and most comprehensive book I read on the evolution of Sikh nationalism at home and abroad, and I think that's a very important dimension of it, is the diaspora dimension. So I'm not gonna provide any close empirical question. I think other people are more suited to do that, but focus more on your kind of overall political, theoretical discussion. So I have some questions regarding your theoretical account on nationhood and nationalism in relation to Sikhs. And I also have a number of questions in relation to the diaspora, and perhaps some questions also in relation to, more current affairs in relation to Hindutva as a kind of existential threat. So those were my kind of points I wanted to. So I really enjoyed your account of different theories of nationalism, how you situate the literature on Sikh nationalism in these three categories: religious community, modern nation, as a minority identity, and how you relate this to different theories of ethnicity and nationalism. But I guess I was a little surprised to see how you kind of remained within the kind of widely criticized notion of ethne as defined by Anthony Smith, where you argue that Oberoi and others have failed to take into account why the Sikh Sabhas were able to redefine the Sikh faith along Khalsa lines. And I take it here that you argue that more constructivist accounts do not give proper attention to the kind of emotional attachment of this ethno-symbolic heritage, which you then described as the Guru Granth Sahib, the persecution and martyrdom in the 17th and 18th century, the life and times of Guru Gobind Singh, and territorialization. And so to me, emotional attachment can, of course, be as strong to a very constructed ethno-symbolic heritage as to is to any kind of realness as defined by Anthony Smith. And that this kind of reconstruction in an ethno-symbolic heritage of Sikh nationalism is not the same as perhaps returning to nothing, as you say in a few places. So I mean, the reconstruction, what you talk about is, of course, some kind of what Vamik Volkan calls the chosen traumas, chosen glories, where the construction itself becomes inherited among the next generation. So my question is, I guess, what is the real risk? And I know you discussed this to some extent, but what is the real risk of essentialism by adhering to an idea of the Khalsa as a quintessential of this kind of Sikh ethne? And I'm also wondering how it really goes together with your quite large discussion throughout the book of the structural fault lines as necessary for understanding the evolvement of Sikh nationalism. So that would be my first question. My second comment concerns your discussion of diaspora, which you also define in relation to the Sikh diaspora community. where I think you similarly talk about how the Sikh diaspora has been understood within 3 chronologically distinct phases. You talked about the global diaspora, the colonial period, as a victim diaspora in relation to 1984, and as a multicultural diaspora in relation to politics of difference. And I really enjoy that kind of background discussion. And where you also note how all 3 tend to overemphasize the kind of relative autonomy of the diaspora. I mean, again, the kind of essentialist elements of diaspora politics. And instead you argue that we need to locate the Sikh diaspora within kind of a web of exchanges between the Punjab and the overseas settlement. And by that, I think you succeed. You succeed in transgressing the kind of autonomy or the more essentialist dimension of diaspora, especially, I think, by pointing to how the diaspora has been divided across places, across caste, across gender, across age, not least, generational kind of divisions. But I'm still a little curious whether you, by that move, talk less about what a diaspora, and in your case, the Sikh diaspora, what the diaspora is than what the diaspora does. I mean, like what Brubaker talks about diaspora as a practice. So in other words, how do we learn about what the different Sikh diasporas do in relation to the homeland through your reconceptualization of Sikh diaspora? And this leads me to another question of where I think you have a very good discussion of how kind of Hindu nationalism and the BJP under Modi, the relationship with RSS, how that has affected the possibility of Sikh nationalism and Sikh identity politics in India. But you talk perhaps less about how the assertion of the Hindu right, also in the diaspora, has affected Sikh diasporic communities and has affected a kind of Sikh diasporic conscience. And especially if we think back of, the last few years with Modi going on his kind of diaspora tour, speaking on the Wembley Stadium, speaking everywhere, and kind of catering to a particular set of Indian kind of diaspora communities. So what does it mean, in some sense? What has Hindutva done to the diaspora communities? I would like to know a little bit more about that, and then perhaps comes through in the book. And I'm also curious about the argument that Hindutva has been conceived increasingly as an existential threat to Sikhs and Sikhism in India. And I'm kind of curious how perhaps if and whether you see this existentialist threat, or what I talk about ontological security question, also among diaspora communities. And extent that this may differ, both in relation to the different host societies, but also in relation to other forms of identifications, in relation to class, caste, gender, etc. So how has this, in some sense, the existential threat, which I think is something that runs through your whole book, actually. It is the kind of existentialist question that I sometimes wish you had spent perhaps a little bit more time on, but that's perhaps my own interest in this from my own work. But I find this, and perhaps especially, you talk about existential threat in terms of religious, political, legal, and economic sense, but it wasn't completely clear to me how that existential threat, even within India, works on all these different levels. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you see this. Political is probably quite easily, and perhaps economic as well, but legal, in what terms does the legality of the identity construction, seeing Hindutva as an existential threat? Where is the kind of legal dimension in this? So I would really like you spelling out how these different dimensions have been affected both in India but also abroad, or whether it is mainly that you talk about this in the question of Sikhs in Indian communities. So I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katarina. That was very, very interesting and very incisive. And you know, puts it in a very relevant and interesting theoretical framework. I know that some of this is going to come up later in the discussions as well, but I'm now going to invite, without further ado, Radhika Chopra to make her comments. Radhika retired as Professor of Sociology from the Delhi School of Sociology in the University of Delhi in 2020, and amongst other publications, Radhika is author of Militant and Migrant, The Politics and Social History of Punjab, which was published in 2011. Radhika, please speak now. You have about 6 to 8 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the LSE South Asia Center and to you, London, for organizing this roundtable, and of course the authors who produced this stellar work, which is challenging all of us to say something, you know, that connects with our own work and theirs. So let me just quickly begin with a very contemporary comment that in April, just last month, the Punjab opposition critiqued the newly elected AAP government of signing away the rights of the river waters.
Sorry, Radhika.
Of the state. Yeah, can you not hear me?
If you can just explain things like AAP, which is not always obvious to everyone.
Right, I'm sorry. Okay, so the newly elected government of the new party, the Aam Aadmi Party, which itself is a new political formation and is currently the government in Delhi, and very recently now in Punjab, has won the elections. Okay, so the opposition then critiqued this Aam Aadmi Party of Punjab for signing away the river waters and the rights over river waters of Punjab to the Aam Aadmi Party government in Delhi. Now, Punjab is frequently, in fact, disputed, and sometimes quite violently, the centre's claim over its river waters. While the Sikh Nirankari clash of April 1978 has often been cited as the moment in which militancy emerged and showed its face more completely, in fact, in roughly the same period of time, in 1976, Indira Gandhi, an equally critical event happened, in which was Indira Gandhi's award of dividing the river waters between 4 states, Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, and Delhi. And that's discussed in the book very briefly, sadly, but I'll come to that. Now, obstructing the work on the Satluj-Yamuna link canal and the killing of migrant labor who was working at the site of the canal, in fact, were a response to the award. And I think that that was a moment simultaneously when the Dharam Yudh Morcha, which is so clearly identified with the claims for Khalistan, actually emerged. And the political strategies of blockading food-pinned villages, Rasta roadways, and of course was inaugurated at the same time. So it seems to me that the award and the response to the award over river waters was in fact an extremely important moment in the formation of the militancy movement in the contemporary period. And it certainly propelled AAB or water onto the modern political landscape. And it was crucial to the emergence of militancy. The authors briefly, but quite persuasively, make a case for the sense of entitlement to the natural resources by Punjab, especially since the name of the state, Punjab, embodied its claim over its own waters. And this claim was also part of the Anandpur Sahib resolution, which is seen as a constitution in the making for the new state of nation state of Khalistan. While the book does not focus on water, the author's reading of the Anandpur Sahib resolution, and I think it's very usefully produced in the appendix of the book, points to the centrality of water in the federalist principles that underlay the ASR or the Anandpur Sahib resolution. Described variously, and the authors cite different work on this, described variously as the Magna Carta for Sikhs, a manifesto of Sikh sovereignty, the resting place for Sikh claims, and so on. The absolute autonomy suggested by these analogies, Magna Carta, manifesto, and so on, are, I found very interestingly, examined, analyzed, and then challenged by the authors, because they argue that the very generalized and almost default understanding of Khalistan as a kind of non-negotiable demand for a separate state does not do justice to the ASR itself and some of its claims. In their view, the ASR needs to be understood as a plea for genuine federalism, not just for the Sikhs in Punjab, but for India as a whole. I think they make this point fairly briefly in the course of the book, though it comes up sort of in a scattered way through the rest. What I found interesting was the fact that while all the key leaders, including Gurdwara, so closely identified with militancy and the separatist movement, they were deeply ambiguous about absolute sovereignty and what it meant and what it would really entail. I think that one of the questions that came to my mind when reading this aspect was that while federalism was so pushed in this in the Anandpur Sahib resolution, what federalism within Sikh structures, political structures, still remains, I mean, internal to the politics of Sikhism, still remains an open question and hasn't really been taken up within the book at all. Now, religion and water are a potent constellation in forging political community. So though the phrase ethno-religious of the subtitle suggests the primacy of religion in Sikh nationalism, the authors have persuasively argued that the discourse of Sikh nationalism was strongly driven by contextual issues. What Sikh nationalism is, how it is understood, in fact, has shifted over time and over geographies. That is a key argument of the book, and I think wonderfully supported by both the historical span of the book as well as the extensive literature that is cited. I think the longitudinal framework enables readers and believers to see the enduring power of myths and memories that were evoked by this idea of Sikh nation. So, for example, they can see the connect between the 18th century and the 21st century Sarva Khalsas as congregations that embodied the federal principle. So despite the vacillations amongst the 20th century leadership, the political terrain of Sikh nationalism did cohere around the fairly successful evocation of key symbols, which were then garnered and then brought into contemporary context from history into the present and back again. The 20th century political legal constellations around the turban and the kirpan are very well covered in the book, especially in the discussion in the diaspora. But what I learned from that discussion, is the way the argument in the book enables a reader to view the resurgence of the diaspora debate over the turban into the more contemporary moment in Indian politics, in the defense of the turban in the schoolboys' uniforms, excited by the debates over the schoolgirls' hijab.
Yeah.
So this debate is alive and well and brings it forward. I think what this does is that it allows us to look at the book as not merely a case of Sikh ethno-nationalism, but in a sense takes the argument of the book as identity being highly contextual into enabling us to look at other contexts as well. I think the book shows us that symbols and identities are not free-floating signifiers, zooming around in a kind of vapid ahistorical space, but they are rooted in debates that draw on history, but shape a present experience. At various points in the book, the politics of Sikh nationalism stubs its toe against the Indian constitution. I think the constitutional submergence of Sikh ethnic identity by Article 25B has been raised, of course, as a critical issue in the ASR, but it's also occupied in an inordinate amount of scholarly and media attention. The authors do pay attention to this, of course, but literally in smaller passages and in smaller discussions within the book, I think there's a very important point being made, which itself a little bit gets submerged by this overarching idea of Sikh nationalism and the submergence of identity by 25B. And that is the fact that constitutional submergence exercised enormous power over everyday lives. How an adoption could be legally recognized, a father's property disposed, whose conjugality was recognized or disregarded, became the very stuff of how Sikh nationalism was felt on a more mundane, everyday plane. Though river waters and boundaries of identity were critical to Sikh and Indian political discourse, the legal dimensions of Sikh custom of inheritance, marriage, adoption, and so on were critical events in individual lives. The authors don't spend too much time on this, but it doesn't mean that as readers we can't cull out these issues from the very rich kind of references and materials and footnotes that the authors do provide. I think the meshing of the political systems, symbols, and everyday practice are an important aspect of this book. I think it is, in fact, important to recognize the Sikh ethne at various levels, including the less coherent level of the everyday. Very briefly to end, in their discussion of Sikh nationalism, the authors cover very familiar terrain and very well-known work and literature. And in exploring and consulting the bibliography as a reader, it also became clear to me that they have moved beyond the tried and tested. For me, the bibliography was a chapter in itself. And I'm certainly going to go back, find myself going back again and again to it for not just the references, but for a more nuanced understanding of familiar issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Radhika. I'm sorry I had to rush you slightly, but I did want to have some time for discussion. Before I invite Lou Fennick, I did want to announce once again for the audience that please do ask questions. We have quite a few questions from someone that have already come in, but please do feel free to ask questions via the chat function on YouTube, and I will pose them at regular and irregular intervals. It is now my very great pleasure to invite Lou Fennick, who is Professor of History at the University of Northern Iowa and is an expert in Sikh studies and the author most recently of The Cherished Five in Sikh History, which was published last year in 2021. Lou is going to first give his own views on the book, and then will forge a discussion, no doubt. So his job is both enviable because he's able to force the discussion, and advantageous because he speaks last. So Lou, you have time now. If you spend about 6 to 8 minutes giving your views, and then we can take forward the discussion. I will come in when I have to ask questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I trust you can all hear me very well. Wow, what a wonderful discussion. I'd like to thank all of you for being here. Thanks to LSE, thank you Nilanjan Sarkar, and thank you to those of you out there and all of you behind the scenes who have made this possible. Yeah, what an excellent discussion this is for an equally excellent book. I think I'd like to begin by pointing to Radhika Chopra's discussion just a moment ago, where she noted and rightfully so, that there are so many little things covered in this book. And that's one of the things I love about it. I don't see this as a one-stop shop text. This is a text you go to. It's introductory. Definitely my seminars and my students, they are all going to have to buy copies of this book for my classes. It covers so many things. It is really quite comprehensive in so many ways, but it provides us with a taste, right? And Radhika, what you were saying about the bibliography, I totally concur, right? Our students will go to that bibliography. They will go to those extensive footnotes, and they will encounter a treasure trove. So really well done. You guys cover everything, and I really loved that about the book. But I notice I'm the only historian here, and insofar as that's concerned, one of the things that ties everything together here is this notion of history. One of the things I've consistently mentioned, and which you've all covered using different terms, is that the notion of sickness, of being sick, is constructed in large part through these extraordinary narratives, but these narratives aren't fixed, they are fluid, and they're, really give rise to the idea, to the answer to the question. Hold on, I'm slipping over my words here because I find this such an excellent book, but it really demonstrates to me that the question to ask is who is history for, rather than what is history? Who is it for? And this really underscores in a sense, the malleable nature of these narratives. For me, within the historical discussion of the book, I really enjoyed references to the Gurdwara reform movement, something I have firmly held to and will explore, in future publications, I hope, is the centrality of the Gurdwara reform movement. I think this is very much a seminal moment in the construction of Sikhness, in the construction of Sikh identity, which certainly is a corollary to the creation of this nationalism, of this Sikh nationalism, of this deterritorialized nationalism, which is so beautifully brought out in your first book, Giorgio. Bashar's comments about sovereignty, that is, of course, something I embrace as well. The issue of sovereignty, too, I'm trying to recall, you gave a very clear definition. I would have liked to have seen some references to the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben's work on Homo sacer or sacer, which would really have helped us round out that idea. But as far as I'm concerned, this is an excellent introductory text. And I think that's the one thing we need to keep in mind. This is a text geared towards undergraduates, which covers a tremendous amount of ground. And for that, my friends, let me just congratulate you. Really superbly done. Okay. And that, my friends, is all I have to say. But just that book makes me happy. So thank you for making me happy.
Well, thank you. I'm going to give you bit of time to catch your breath before we start the discussion. In the meantime, can I just ask a few questions that have come in? What I will do, and before that, I should say that Giorgio's book on Sikh nationalism and identity, that's the link we've posted on the YouTube chat. So for those in the audience who are wondering what that link is, it's the link to that book that Giorgio had actually posted in the chat function here on the Zoom call, and we've just posted it on YouTube. Gurharpal, this question is for you. I'm going to read the question verbatim because I'm not going to paraphrase what someone else has said, okay? My question regards the role of the elites. How is their authority constricted by sacred texts? I'm researching implementation of the Nanak-Shahi calendar in the Punjab. Their authority seems unchallenged by everyday devotees. They switch Sikh calendars for their Gurdwaras from Bikrami to Nanak Shahis as it fits their political interests. Fine, shall I read it again or you've got it? You need to switch on your mic.
I think I know where this is coming from UCL. We've had a discussion before. The elites, the term elites that is used in the work refers largely to political elites in the context of managing Sikh political formations. But what is not used or referred to are those in holding positions of authority within Sikh institutions like the SGPC, although they tend also to be controlled by political elites, as has been the case in the last 20 years or so under the Badal regime. So I think one has to be clear about what kind of elites one is talking about. And secondly, if we're talking about debates within the Sikh political system, they're enormously complex. And I'm not sure I'm necessarily the right authority to speak on them with any confidence. As we've seen today or a few days ago, there are disputes about authority within the Akal Takht about certain pronouncements of Sikh scriptures in the diaspora. And these are interminably complex, and so I'm sorry, I really don't have the expertise to talk about the SGPC per se.
Okay, Giorgio, there's a question for you. But before I ask that, I should also say that there are a series of questions that Katarina raised, which once I've asked this question between you, Giorgio, and Gurharpal, if you can respond, but also others can chip in. So Giorgio, this is the question from the member of the audience. I'm going to read it. Shouldn't the role of democracy as a system of government in South Asia have a more detailed analysis? Democracy generates a social arena without a clear hegemonic framework in which different ideologies compete with each other. This increases conflicts and radicalization. In fact, Hansen, I'm assuming that's Thomas Hansen, Hansen has previously explored it to understand the rise of Hindu nationalism and highlighted it as one of the main reasons behind its current invigoration. The reason I read out this question now is, Giorgio, alongside answering this, you could perhaps also take up on the series of questions that Katarina posed. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Nilanjan, and thank you to all the discussants and the contributors for their close reading of the text and for their excellent questions. And we're really honored, or at least I'm very honored that this work has been read so closely and am in agreement with most of the comments raised. Looking at this particular question, I would agree, yes. Why not? Yeah, we should have had a more detailed analysis of democracy within South Asia. However, I would take issue with the idea that democracy generates a social arena without a clear hegemonic framework. I think that underlying democracies would be certain understandings, I would say cosmological understandings, but certain cultural or cultural political underpinnings which allow democracy to function in a particular way. The idea of the individual voter, for an example, is incomprehensible without an understanding of how the individual developed within a Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian tradition. I think the role of colonialism certainly for me would be of greater importance than looking at democracy per se, although the two are intertwined. So thank you for that question. I would like to thank Bashar for his questions and his analysis of the book. I don't have time really to respond to the excellent points made, but certainly I do think that there should be perhaps more of, and this also goes to Lou's point, more of a genealogy of sovereignty within the Sikh tradition, which perhaps foregrounds the work of Guru Nanak and links it with Gobind, with Guru Gobind. So I would agree with him on that. I would like to take Lou's point to respond to Katarina. So thank you very much, Katarina, for your excellent question and comments, of which I'm in agreement with most of them. I would point out that what we tried to do is to come up with an accessible volume. I was under strict instructions to make it as accessible as possible and not to reproduce my previous work, which did go into greater detail with the difficulties of articulating a territorial nationalism without essentializing an idea of ethnicity and religion. They're all discourses, they're all narratives: religion, nationalism, ethnicity, minority. But as we mentioned in the introduction, they're braided in different ways. And as Lou said, they're fluid. The one point, perhaps, I think, which will be constitutive of perhaps a larger discussion would be your excellent work on ontological security. And I think you use, ontological security from a Lacanian framework, which is very different from how ontological security is deployed within international relations from a reading of Giddens. And I think within Sikhism, within Sikhi, it's the idea of the self and other. And whether the self and other are separate, I would view it as a relational cosmology where it is difficult to make that separation. Therefore, when we talk about ideas of an existential threat, it's a threat to, a threat to being assimilated into a relational, in want of a better term, Hindu tradition. And this gives rise to the defensiveness of nationalism, which draws on, I would say, a Judeo-Christian framework, which is reproduced through the French Revolution and narratives of popular sovereignty. And thank you, Radhika, for your excellent comments as well. I'm not able to answer them at this point, but thank you to everybody for your comments.
I'm going to ask Gurdwara to speak now, but before that, Giorgio, did you want to say anything about Katarina's point about diaspora identity and Sikh diaspora identity and Hindu diaspora, Hindutva ideology and diaspora. Was there something you wanted to say about that specifically?
I hope I answered it, but it wasn't specifically on the diaspora, but it was on the idea of a relational cosmology without ideas of self and other. Specifically, I think that may take us in a different direction. If we focus on diaspora, the idea of this book is to look at diaspora as integrative within the study of Sikh nationalism per se. But thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. I just thought I'd clarify that and give you this chance. Gurharpal, please speak.
Yeah, I want to thank every one of the discussants for their excellent comments and contributions. And I'll just take up some of the points that I've noted, and many of them have been answered. Regarding some of the issues raised by Bashar, the issue of sovereignty, it was a big one. And let me just say clearly, this is a work of synthesis written for students. It's a readable text. I mean, we could have, on many of the things, we could have written volumes on their own. I'm currently working on a project on the partition of India and the Sikhs. And I think that will be a 2 or 3 volume project. So the chapter is a very brief synthesis of what is there to be done. And I'm sorry, Bashar, if you found Mountbatten's comments offensive. There's a lot the British colonialists wrote about Sikhs, which is quite offensive. That they and this will be coming out in other volumes. But interestingly, that footnote was sent to me by a friend of mine, so I had to include it in the text in acknowledging what he had sent. But it was indicative of how the British were dealing with the Sikhs at the time. As for you made a point about the Gurdwaras Act of 1925, whether any government will have the capacity to amend it, repeal it, change it. We live in very interesting times in India at the moment. We live in times when the center in India is trying to appropriate a Sikh leadership and certain elements of the faith, and they have a very clear conception of what Sikhism is and how Sikhism should be. Perhaps that will be the last vestige of autonomy that will eventually be eroded. Many things of minority of minorities and legal statuses of minorities in India are being eroded. Issues relating to minority schools, minority trusts, minority rights. It's not inconceivable, I think. I mean, the book in the chapter on Hindutva ends somewhat pessimistically, saying that there is a real threat to Sikh identity and Sikhism. And, it's an even chance that Sikhism might revert back to Hinduism as it did in the past, in the 18th and 19th centuries. So there is a real issue there, and I think we can go on about that much more. On Katarina's points regarding the diaspora and Hindu nationalism, I think what the diaspora is and how it acts are important distinctions. And there is, again, the same processes that are operating in India operate overseas, efforts to accommodate, assimilate, co-opt, and to also marginalize elements which are seen to be antagonistic or uncooperative to conception of the Hindu idea of the Indian nation. I see that here in organizational practices almost every day now. I see it in efforts to construct or capture educational institutions, establish even, dare I say, a particular university position. So there is competition. There is institutional, political, and religious competition at all levels. So in the way we've conceptualized about the diaspora, we recognize the diversity within the diaspora as there is diversity within the Sikh community itself. Yeah. So that diversity does act as a constraint on action, but it also tends to be overlaid by events like 1984. So that, in a sense, was a point that we were trying to make. As for Radhika's comments, I really have no difference. I mean, I'm very grateful to your very deep and sharp understanding of some of the key issues. And if we haven't covered things in sufficient detail, it's again the constraint of time and limitation of it's a word limit. But we are appealing, in writing this book, we are appealing to a new audience of students and graduates who will be coming to the subject. And unlike us, or at least unlike me, who's incapable of doing much more, that they will be enthused to take these subjects up and do more excellent research and come back to us. So, and for Lou's point, interestingly, who is history for and what is history? Well, I'm reminded of E.H. Carr, and in writing this book, I started out doing history initially, but ended up doing government. So our aim, I know Giorgio, it's like this book is like a combination, an authorship by the odd couple. I'm a strict positivist and Giorgio is a critical theorist. So I'm surprised nobody's picked up on this odd couple business. The work, I mean, it's rich in its empirical data, partly because in my field, you can't get away without data and verifying what you say. So, so in that sense, the history, whatever we've said, we've tried to verify it. Although if we'd gone down the route of who is it for, that would have been a very different book.
Thank you very much. I was hoping you would answer that question, given that I study 14th century Persian texts. I thought that you must answer this. Could I just say, just because, and I've just finished reading it, just because you mentioned E.H. Carr, that her granddaughter, Helen Carr, has a volume called What is History Now?
Oh, okay.
By Helen Carr, and it's an edited volume, which makes for equally interesting reading because it picks up on a lot of threads of E.H. Carr's What is History, which we've all read, along with Collingwood, the other very readable person. We're doing very good for time. We have about 5-7 minutes more. Lou, can I invite you to say something?
Well, again, thank you very much. Yeah, there are a couple of really interesting post-book events which have occurred, which I would love to hear your take on. We mentioned the victory of AAP, the Aam Aadmi Party in the recent elections, but also something which happened very soon after the farmer victory. Yeah. Well, I guess we can sort of call it a victory, though really going back to that old Mandi system doesn't seem particularly victorious to me, with all due respect. But the death of Deep Singh Sidhu, right, which at least a week or so, up until a week or so after it had happened, it mobilized large numbers of Sikhs in Punjab. And again, it seems to have almost fizzled out, though I could be wrong about that. But I'd love to hear your take on how this may fit into the type of deterritorialized Sikh nationalism. Of course, as a historian, particularly one who's written on Shahidi in Sikh tradition, I have my own views, but I'd love to hear what you guys think about that.
Either of you want to go first, but before that, I just thought I'd quickly say, Radhika, did you want to come in to say something? You need to switch on your mic. Yeah.
I have a different point to make, so maybe after this, it's just a half minute.
Sorry, do you want to just go ahead and say it? So
all right. You know, because the book has argued so strongly for the Gurdwara as a specific space for the emergence of the idea of nationalism and so on. I think there's another aspect to this, because the chapters 6 and 7, I think they are, dwell so much also on the significance of 1984. I think there's another aspect that emerges from this book, and I think it's an important one that I'd like to put forward, which is that in some ways, it seems to me that Operation Blue Star provided a blueprint of a sort for the Indian state as much as it did for, you know, energizing or coalescing the demand for a separate state. That is, it was a blueprint for the Indian state to move into sacred spaces like the Babri Masjid. And the two are by no means identical. This is not my argument at all. This is not my contention. But I think, I mean, you know, obviously in the first case, the Indian state was an active agent in Blue Star in December 1992. It was a seeming bystander to a seeming popular upsurge of emotion. But I think stillness or inaction itself is a political act. But one of the things that connects these two disparate events is that it was a political policy of violating hallowed ground. And that is where the idea of the Gurdwara as a central space, why did it sort of, you know, provide so much? What is it about that space that provided so much emotion from amongst the Sikhs and others? And it seems to me it's because of the vis-a-vis with the Indian state. And what the Indian state, what Blue Star and the entry into the Golden Temple, the Darbar Sahib, enabled was subsequent violations, if you will, desecrations of hallowed ground.
Gurharpal and Giorgio, do you just want to respond to these two first, and then we can ask Katarina and Bashar for their last comments? Yeah, Gurharpal, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I respond to Lou's comments first about ARP and the farmers' agitation and the death of Deep Sidhu. If you read chapter 7 quite carefully, underlying it, there is an assumption that you know, that a movement is waiting to take off. The conditions, the structural conditions for it are almost ripe. This was pre-pandemic when it was written, but it requires the right kind of agency. Unfortunately, what happened, or fortunately or unfortunately, however you might want to see it, the political party that would have been the natural beneficiary of this condition was the Shromani Akali Dal. But the Shromani Akali Dal had got itself on the wrong side of the Sikh population by mismanaging the regional politics of the province in the last 20 years, or the years it's been in power. And also being on the wrong side of the farmers' agitation. Right. So ARP's victory, as I've outlined in a couple of presentations for Sikh formations and others, is an accidental victory. Right. It's not a pro-ARP victory, but it's an it's an anti-establishment victory. And the radicalism of AAP is not inconsistent with the Sikh nationalist or the Sikh nationalist spectrum that is outlined in the book, one of which relates to the, goes back to the radical tradition of Bhagat Singh and the Communist Party. So, the radicalism as revolutionary socialism and protest is part of the Sikh tradition. And I've said somewhere, after the Akali movement, the farmers movement is probably the most significant political protest movement if you take out the intervening period of militancy. So the ARP is a bundle of contradictions. It might fall apart, it might disintegrate, or Mr. Mann might become the new Zelensky in the future. Who knows? We live in very fluid times. He's an able politician who connects really well. I mean, he's not just a drunkard, but you listen to his discourse. He's able to straddle many horses simultaneously. To Radhika's points, I think is very insightful. I had an inkling of a feeling that something like this would happen after 1984. The invasion of sacred spaces was common during British rule, under colonialism. But then towards the end, the British withdrew from that. But after 1992, I wrote an article it was ostensibly on Punjab, which argued that India should be seen as an ethnic democracy. That was in 1995, and 25 years before Modi, before Jafralay's book on Modi. So, that landmark development was then subsequently led to the rise of BJP and the state we're in at the moment. So, and also was very central to the work of Peter van der Veer, the Religious Nationalism volume that sort of lays out the roots of religious nationalism in South Asia. So thank you. I mean, is that enough?
Sure, thank you. We are short of time. Giorgio, do you want to come in and comment briefly, and then we'll ask Bashar and Katarina?
No, I just wanted to thank Lou for his question and Radhika. So I think Gopal sort of summarized the response, but if you could bring in.
Sure. Katarina, would you like to say something by way of closing remarks?
No, I don't really. I would just like to again just say that thanks for this wonderful book, and I really, the last discussion of the sacredness and buildings and Gurdwara, I think is a really interesting and important dimension of how we in some sense create facts on the ground and the symbolism around these kind of sacred building, and how material objects in some sense becomes these contentious subjects. So I have no more questions, but thank you so much for letting me read this. I really enjoyed it.
Bashar Singh, would you like to say anything by way of closing remarks?
Just I want to say that Gurupal's description of AAP victory as an accidental, that makes sense, because two normal, parties, Congress and Akali Dal, they were in their election strategy, they were attacking each other, They never knew, for example, that AAP will emerge in such a big way. So it was a shock to both Congress as well as Akali Dal, when they were attacking each other. For example, Navjot Singh Sidhu and Majithia were, people were looking at that constituency that one of them, is going to win. But AAP candidate, that girl, she was working behind the scenes, meeting the people and so on. So they strategized everything, very carefully, without entering into any controversial space that was covered by Akali Dal and Congress. So it's a victory. For 5 years, a lot of thinking has to go on within the Akali Dal as well as the Congress, So let's hope, but it's very interesting. This book is not really covering recent events. It was written much before the time. But this is excellent work. I have enjoyed today's conversation very much. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. And it is now I'm afraid we really must wrap up now. But I do want to thank each of you individually: Gurdwara Singh, Giorgio, Shani, Bashar Singh, Catarina Kinnvall, Radhika Chopra, and Fennick. All of you for your contributions, for your time, for your expertise, the generosity with which you have shared them, and for forging this wonderful discussion. It's been a joy to host it. And to our audience who've been watching, those who've asked questions, those who haven't asked questions, and someone who asked a question and then retracted it. To all of you, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.